Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Rogue Health Economist. We are into our second week, and this week we are going to be talking about the topic of community. This whole podcast is built on the idea that we need to find ways to flatten the curve on healthcare costs, where exponential costs have happened in healthcare in all the major industrialized nations. We want to look at the ways in which we can get curves to flatten out and start to go down. And last week, we talked about some of the foundational economic principles that we're going to come back to again and again, like negative externalities or externalities in general. We talked about the law of diminishing marginal returns. And so this week, I really want to focus on the topic of community, because this has been something that has been all the way through my rogue work over the last 10 years. I outed myself in my book, The Community Cure, that came out in January, as I was actually born in an intentional community in Colorado. And so growing up in community, both in Colorado, the UK, and South Africa, really shaped my viewpoint of the world. And as I've gone through my life in the rest of the world, I've been able to see things through that lens. And ultimately, that's what led me to see, as an example, externalities. Like, externalities don't just fly off somewhere else. They're actually if we're part of one interconnected ecosystem, then it's clear that those externalities are going to have effect on the rest of society. So this has been the way that I've seen things. And then over the last sort of 6 or 7 years, as I've started to express my own ideas on what we should be doing to solve healthcare, it's all been built around community. So the Functional Forum started as a meetup group for doctors interested in functional medicine in New York. It spawned meetup groups all the way across the world as groups of practitioners got together to learn about functional medicine in community. Then we started to teach doctors how to build community around their practices, right? How to find ways to introduce people who wanted to get healthy to each other. And then the last few years, I started an insurance alternative built on medical cost sharing. So groups of people coming up with ideas on, coming up with agreements on how they would share their health costs, and then doing that as an alternative to health insurance. And then more recently, really focusing in on group medical visits and finding ways to get doctors of all shapes and sizes to see the power of community as executed inside the medical system via group medical visits. And so it's all been the theme of community. And so what I wanted to do today was to just share some of the sort of foundational principles and why it's so important for where we are today, because this is a sort of a moment in history where resources are going away more quickly than at any other time in modern human history. With 30 plus million people unemployed in the US right now, we're seeing a big change in the economic environment, and therefore we need to think about what solutions we need to use. And I want to start today by sharing a story about someone that I met 2 years ago. We did this bus tour all around America, 40 cities, went to all kinds of different events and met some super interesting people on the way. But I went to see this guy. I went to an event called Women Teach Men. It was held in Ojai in the summer of 2018. Esther Perel was one of the speakers. There were a number of different speakers. It was a really interesting weekend. But one of the people that I met there was a marine evolutionary biologist, a marine biologist actually from Duke. And he shared with me something really interesting as it relates to community that I think is, how does nature deal with a lack of resources, right? When resources fall away, how does nature deal with it? He gave the example of beds of mussels. So if you have a situation in the sea where there's lots of resources, so like a good amount of nutrition available, a good amount of oxygen in the water, like what do mussels need to grow? They need nutrients from the sea. They need, they need oxygen. And when that's in abundance, mussel beds just form randomly, right? You'd look there and you'd see, okay, there's mussels all over the place, but there's no distinct pattern. When mussels grow in periods of reduced resources, right, where there's not the amount of nutrition and oxygen and other things in the water for them to grow, how do they grow? They grow in clumps. And what this man said was that the reason why they grow in clumps is because in the time of reduced resources, these muscles need to form in clumps because they need the positive externalities or the positive feedback loops of being in community with other muscles in order to survive. When resources are available, they can go however they want, but when resources are short, we need to form communities to get those positive feedback loops. And ultimately, this topic is super interesting because it really spoke to my heart of realizing, like, what is the power of community? When the settlers were first coming to America, they didn't live in suburbs, right? They didn't live away from each other. You live in community because you realize that it's a super efficient way of living because everyone can help support each other and you're not, by yourself. Only when resources became unbelievably available, like with in the 20th century, did we see people moving to a style of living that was very insular, right? Where you didn't have to know your neighbors, where you didn't have to require your neighbors for anything that you did. And I think that's just a really interesting way of thinking about resources. So in my book, The Community Cure, I gave an example of some of the things that I want to talk about here today. One of my favorite quotes on community is from Thich Nhat Hanh, who says, "Community is the guru of the future." And there's lots of different sort of interpretations in English of that key concept, but that actually in the future, gurus wouldn't be one person sharing knowledge. It would actually be groups of people working together in community. And you can find that book, The Community Cure. Here it is. It's available on Amazon. It's on audiobook, but I go deep into it. One of the books I talk about in the early phase is this book called The Third Pillar by Raghuram Rajan, who is an IMF economist and has actually worked in like really high positions in the Indian government and in the IMF, in the International Monetary Fund. And his book says how markets and the state leave community behind. So one of the things I want to share about this topic with communities, in his book, he says that, in all aspects of life, we see that either markets or community need to solve our problems, and that we sort of become very focused on this. And if we look just at the discourse now, let's say in the last year, let's look in America about how we can solve healthcare, right? What is the solution for healthcare? So on one side, on the sort of Democrat side, the Bernie Sanders side, you've got Medicare for all, which is essentially the government coming in to solve the problem. So Medicare for all, the government solves for everyone, and we see that there. Then on the other side, on the sort of like, if you look at the Republican side of what the Republicans think is the solution for healthcare, it's much more on a market side. So market-based solutions, things like direct primary care, things like medical cost sharing and supporting those things, equally. And so ultimately what Raghuram Rajan talks about in his book is that the reason why we see that there are only these two options, right, where we see that either markets or government can solve our problems is because over the last 400 years, we've seen the death of community. And that is the third pillar in his book. And ultimately, community is something that is not really either government or markets. It's this kind of third way of living. And there's been a lot of talk recently about things like counter economics, right? How do we take advantage of counter economics? And an example of counter economics might be, in your street, if your neighbor grows tomatoes and you grow plums and, the other neighbor grows lettuce and something, is there a way that you can all work together to share produce and not have to interact with either government food subsidies or, government food delivery like the food bank, or going to the market and actually buying from, some farmer that you don't know, far away via Costco or whatever store you go to. And so, in just like in nature, community is a really efficient way of sharing resources and using resources. And so, at this moment in time where we have this huge number of people unemployed, we need community to fill in that gap, because without community, the only other options are government or the markets. And so, you see that obviously, we're in this place right now. So how would we able to use the power of community to solve some of these problems? Well, ultimately, what we talked about in my book was this power of group visits and group care. And throughout this week, we're going to be talking to people who are innovating in different areas of community. You can think about the community of microbes that live on and around us all the time, and how we're in commune with microbes. So on Friday, we're going to be talking with Dr. Zach Bush, who is one of the foremost thinkers in this area, and someone that I've been wanting to connect with for a long time. And I've just seen the amount of content that he's been putting out about even in this COVID era, like, can we really escape pathogens? Like, are we really setting ourselves up and thinking right where we think that we can sort of avoid pathogens? And Bill Maher even talked about this the other day on his show. We're going to talk with Mark Wynn, who's been building community in the island of Guernsey. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Guernsey, which is a small island between England and France, and put on an event called Journey to 100. And it was all about trying to see if Guernsey could become the first country in the world to get to life expectancy 100. And we had a lot of amazing speakers on things like the food system and the medical system, and also community as a main concept in there. But ultimately, where I see the biggest potential for community is actually in group medical visits. So actually building community inside the medical system and having people access that. And that's for two main reasons. One, there's already budget assigned, right? In every country in the world, there's some sort of budget assigned for healthcare. In the UK, that could look like the National Health Service. In the US, you could see Medicare and Medicaid. There's budget associated and given to people. And so creating community inside the healthcare system is definitely able to happen there. And second, because people who don't have community, lonely people, end up in the healthcare system, because loneliness and social isolation is the biggest driver of all-cause mortality, right? It's the bigger driver than smoking, than nutrition, than alcohol. And just think of all of the efforts that we put forward in order to all the efforts that we put forward in order to deal with those issues at sort of a public health capacity. And yet social isolation is the biggest driver of all-cause mortality. And that's why a growing number of voices in this COVID era are starting to think about, hey, yes, there are deaths from COVID, but yes, there are also going to be deaths from isolation. And those might look like suicide. Those might look like alcohol and drug overdoses and more use of drugs, as people start to come face to face with the fact that these are deaths that are associated with the downturn in the economy. And this is very well documented. We've had enough recessions over the last 100 years to see, how many people die of what during the Great Depression. And so ultimately, these are real considerations here moving forward. And so I've been a huge advocate for building group delivered care inside the health system. But right now we're in a position where that was happening and now has completely stopped happening because of COVID, right? You see the vast majority of hospitals are out of business or on low business because they're only treating COVID patients. You've seen doctors and primary care and all the things we spoke about last week. Like, the majority of medicine in America is furloughed, is out of business. And so there's not a lot of group visits happening. The good news is there is more and more group connectivity happening online. And tomorrow we're actually going to be hearing from Dr. Cheng Ron, who is doing virtual group visits. And he shared some incredible insight with me just about how powerful it is to, one, shift from a single kind of relationship with a doctor, right, where you only have one healthy relationship with a doctor, to a sort of a bi-directional relationship where now the doctor is learning more about people's homes and what they look like by using things like telemedicine. And then not only that, giving people a community of people who they can be supported by. And ultimately, this quote comes from the book. I was talking in this piece about this concept called open source wellness that is based in Oakland. And Open Source Wellness has created this 16-week in-person group visit training to be able to help patients who have a lifestyle disease go through a process of dealing with the fundamentals of health creation, like exercise and food and nutrition and meditation, and not just talking about it, but actually doing it. And what they found that in 16 weeks, they can take people who have never meditated, who have only ever eaten processed food, and help them go through a journey of transformation to, to be able to reclaim their health and then be in the position to actually help others do it, to become a peer leader. And that's when I said, when we have this 16-week journey from disempowered participant to potential peer leader, now we have the right ingredients for an exponential movement. And it's going to take an exponential movement to change the cost curve in healthcare, because ultimately we need to have a lot of people supporting a lot of other people to be able to create self-efficacy and to be able to get people to a point where they are able to be independent of the healthcare system, where they're able to get off pharmaceuticals and just live a long and healthy life into their 9th and 10th decade. And that's what it's going to take to do that. So over this week, we'll be going more into some of these pieces. And this is, as I shared on Friday, my thesis for health transformation. And it's really about creating new layers of value that are much more cost effective to deliver. And that's one, changing the culture, right? Creating a culture of health. And that's going to be mainly done through content. Then 2 is community, creating structures whereby people can support each other, much like you would see with alcoholics, how alcoholics form these, groups like Alcoholics Anonymous that's free, where people support each other, that once someone becomes dry and gets off the alcohol, they're then in a position where they support other people through sponsorship, and the whole thing is free. And the whole thing is valuable not only to the person who's trying to get off, but the person who already gets off. And there's just value delivered to everyone in the system at no cost. There's also things like Overeaters Anonymous and other group structures that have existed for years following that same formula. And so this week, we're really going to focus on community, because I believe that community is the most powerful tool that we can use to transform health outcomes. And so during this week, we're going to speak to a number of people who are on the cutting edge doing this, and not just doing it before COVID, but doing it right now. So tomorrow we're going to hear from Dr. Cheng Ruan. On Wednesday, we're going to hear from Mark Wynn, who is bringing a lot of these ideas into his community of 60,000 people in Guernsey. And then on Friday, we're going to hear from Dr. Zach Bush. So it's going to be a really fun week. I hope that you can join us. We've got a lot of great content coming in. I'd love to see any of your thoughts and questions, or if you have ideas on how you've seen community being accessed. This is the Rogue Health Economist. Please visit our sponsors, The Evolution of Medicine. The virtual practice pivot guide that we created can help health professionals make the switch to going online. And one of the things that we talk about in this practice pivot guide is the virtual group visit. And I'm super excited to be sharing more as we go along this week, because we have some exciting announcement coming out tomorrow about virtual group visits and about delivering and accessing functional medicine that's affordable and accessible to everyone. Make sure to tune in tomorrow. Thanks so much for tuning in today. My name's James Maskell. This is the Rogue Health Economist livecast. Please share this with your community, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.